I'm sitting with Peter Harris, a man who has a unique perspective on the 1994 elections, which is documented in this book, Birth, The Conspiracy to Stop the 94 Election. At the time, Peter was the head of the monitoring directorate at the IEC. And Peter, when you think back 20 years to the day of the elections, can you remember your mood as you woke up that morning?
Yeah, I mean, it was real apprehension. I mean, we got in, I think we probably got about 2 hours sleep the night before, if that, and got to the to IC headquarters in Cray Street, I think at about 3:30, 4 or thereabouts, and just waited for the day to unfold, because all the preparations were done and complete, and it was great anxiety, great apprehension.
It was a tumultuous lead up into the to polling day. We had the IFP coming in at a very late stage, and we saw the violent reaction from the right wing, the bombs that were going
That's
off.
right, yeah.
Were you apprehensive that bombings, that destabilization was going to be the way the day would unfold?
Yeah, the security information and sort of intelligence we were getting from various groupings, including from sort of national security, from the government, and including from ANC intelligence and other sources, was that there would be violence before, in the run-up to the election, and on election day and subsequently through the count, which of course proved to be true, because on the Sunday before the election, there was the Bree Street bomb,
Yes,
which blew up. It was the biggest car bomb ever placed in, or ever exploded in South Africa, and it blew bodies 10 stories high and killed a lot of people. And then with each passing day, there were other bombs, some of a very serious nature. And then on election day itself, there was, it started off with a bomb at what was then Jan Smuts International Airport.
that's right. Let's go to that incident. We also had the incredible tensions on the East Rand, in particular, between IFP and ANC supporters, and there was obviously a sense that might erupt into something extremely bloody, which we had seen. But on the day, as we were now getting ready, when you heard the news of the bomb at Jan Smuts Airport, did you think this is now the start of what is going to be a very bad day?
Look, it wasn't a good start, clearly. It was a very bad start. And then there were other bombs that went off, but not sort of massive bombs. There were sort of polling stations, 1 or 2 polling stations were petrol bombed, and there were sort of smaller devices, but nothing on the scale of a massive car bomb, which is what took place at the airport. So, yeah, I mean, it made us very apprehensive. I mean, the fact of the matter is that while the lead up to the election had been filled with violence in a number of areas, and there were no-go areas in terms of where particular parties could campaign and so on, strangely enough, apart from those bombs, election day itself was extraordinarily peaceful.
That's right. When did you start getting the word of the enormous queues and the images that now really symbolize election day of 1994? When did you start getting that sense this is actually, a miracle is starting to happen?
Yeah. Look, the queues had started to form at about 4 o'clock in the morning, if not sooner in some areas. And there's, as the history books show, and the pictures show, those queues sort of snaked around blocks and blocks and blocks until they reached the polling station. But, the patience of the people and the voters was extraordinary, because part of the problem with the election is that there had been a contingency supply of ballots that had been kept in various warehouses around the country, because one of the major issues about running an election of this nature, and firstly, most elections had been purely for white people. Before them, it was approximately 3 million voters. This one was for 22 million people. But the biggest obstacle was there was no voter registration list. And the benefit of a voter registration list is that you'll know that 3,000 voters are allocated to vote at the Wanderers Golf Club, or at a school in Soweto, or wherever it may be, or in Katlehong. So you have 3,000 ballots there, and pencils and lights and ink and so on. But where there's no voter registration and allocation of voters to a particular area, you can get up to 50,000 people converging on one voting station and 200 on another.
That's right.
So the movement of ballots between stations was absolutely vital, which is why those contingency reserves had been kept back. And then when the IFP came into the equation 6 days before the election on the 19th of April, and we had to establish a lot more voting stations, obviously particularly in KwaZulu-Natal. And what happened was that that contingency got moved to those areas. So in fact there was no contingency. There were very few contingency supplies left. So when you had an oversupply of voters at a particular station, and then you went to another station and said, look, you've only got 1,000 here, but there's 10,000 people waiting there. The polling officers said, no, we want to hold on to our ballots just in case another 5,000 people arrive in the afternoon.
Yes.
And that caused a lot of problems with the supply of ballots.
What, in terms of your work that day, you were putting out fires all the time, weren't you? And
Yeah. I mean, firstly, we got called in by the commission and asked to try and find those extra ballots, and we were sending people to warehouses and trying to get them open and etc. And a lot of people feared that there was an intentional hoarding of ballots by warehouse managers in an attempt to sabotage the election. And while we found that in one particular case, it wasn't a general rule, actually.
yes. Did you allow yourself during that day to sit and try and get a big picture and say to yourself, well, the miracle is happening? Were you capable of drawing that conclusion at that time? I suppose after the fact it's easy enough.
Yeah, it was much easier after the fact. I think during the course of the day we were just running and addressing urgent situations throughout, but particularly the shortage of ballots in particular areas. And then as we got through the first day, because of the shortage of supply of ballots in particular areas, the instruction was given by the Commission and by Johan Kriegler that emergency printing should take place. And we assisted in that process.
I remember FW de Klerk making the announcement that there would be a second day of
right.
polling.
Yeah.
Can you remember that decision-making process when it dawned on the IEC? Was it a decision that Kriegler made in consultation with people like yourself?
No, Johan Kriegler made that decision with the IEC commissioners. I wasn't a commissioner. I was at an operational level, which I reported into the commission. But very often we were a part of those meetings and we'd be asked for advice, and which we'd give that advice. But the decision was ultimately made by the commission, and they then relayed that to Nelson Mandela and FW de Klerk. And because at that stage there was virtually joint decision making on everything.
That's right, yes. At what stage was the realization that a second day needed to take place?
No, because as the reports were coming into the operations centre, which was run by Perishore Kema, he did a remarkable job, it became clear that there was not sufficient time for people to exercise their right to vote. And it was absolutely fundamental in this election that it would take as long as it took to give everyone the opportunity to exercise that first democratic right.
Once the voting had taken place and had gone peacefully, we had no further bombs, there was no time for you to sit back, was there? There was now the whole process of counting the ballots, and as your book rather dramatically starts, the whole system got hacked into, and I think that
yeah, look, I mean, the counting of ballots was essentially run by election administration, which was under which was headed by a guy called Piet Collane, who was the Director General of Home Affairs, and problems were encountered quite soon on in the count, and I think largely because the same people who were actually running the voting process were then allocated to the counting process with some extras.
Yes. And
they were just simply, at the end of their tether, they were just completely and utterly exhausted. So there were a lot of logistical problems around the count. But it took place slowly and chaotically in parts. In some provinces were a lot better than others. But there were problems. And then what would happen from those counts, because it was agreed that between the parties that they wouldn't count at the voting stations, which some countries do.
Yes.
They count at the voting stations, which frankly is a far better way to do it. but they just thought that logistically that would be very difficult. So, in fact, all of the ballot boxes were then taken from each voting station to a counting station, a centralized counting station. So you might have one for Durban or Joburg or Soweto or X or Y or Z. And it was there that the count was going to take place, which it did. And it took a very long time, much longer than expected. And then those results would go into a computer center, which was run by election administration, where the results would then get inputted into a computer program.
Yes.
And the tally would rise. And it was, as they were inputted and the tally would rise, there was a massive communication center, you probably recall, at Gallagher Estate. And they had these sort of big boards up, like you get in an international airport.
That's right.
You got, those like things just go like that, as the votes would come in for the ANC or, the other parties or the National Party and so on.
But tell me about the concerns that the numbers were being manipulated.
Well, it wasn't a concern. I mean, we didn't have a concern that the number was being manipulated until an individual, I think he was Washington-based from the international, I think he was for the UN actually, called Michael Yard. He detected, he ran an audit on the morning of the 3rd of May, if I recall, at about 5 o'clock. And it showed that the count wasn't correct. And then he ran more and more audits, and in fact what it transpired is that the votes of 3 parties were being multiplied by 0.033.
Yes.
So as you would input each tally sheet, it would multiply the votes of 3 parties. And then we realized that in fact it was realized that the electronic counting system had been hacked.
Yes.
And that's when the votes stopped going out to Gallagher Estate for about 2 days, if you recall. And that was because we were running, in monitoring, we were running a manual count behind the electronic count, which was a check. And that was to allow the manual count to get past the electronic count, because it was running about 2 days behind.
Do you think in the end, the fairest process was followed?
I think that the result was fair and accurate. It's not to say there wasn't some sort of horse trading between parties around pirate stations in KwaZulu and pirate stations in the Transkei. So there was a little bit of horse trading on that score, but the result was a fair and accurate one.
I just remember covering the levels of violence, the right wing, the Mangosuthu Buthelezi with his war talk, the secessionist talk from Goodwill Zwelatini, the violence on the East Rand. As we came closer and closer to election day, I never thought that this was actually going to go off peacefully at all. I was completely pessimistic. When you looked at the context in which the elections took place, how optimistic were you? Did you allow yourself to be that this could go well?
We had serious anxiety and very serious concerns that the levels of violence would be such that the election could not take place in a manner which was free and fair. One from the right wing, and they frankly did their best to derail it. But I think that a lot of the sting was taken out of the right wing by the fact that General Constant Viljoen decided to participate in the Freedom Front, and he took a lot of the generals with him, frankly. Yes. And the big fear with the right wing was that the security forces and primarily the generals would not go along with the transition. And the fact that he actually registered a political party and took a lot of those generals with him was quite fundamental.
And I would imagine as well, while the involvement of Inkatha Freedom Party in the elections...
well, that was the second factor.
That was...
because we expected, the IFP had made it very clear that they would not allow campaigning in the areas which were under their control in KwaZulu-Natal. And then certain very isolated areas on the East Rand and in the Vaal, where there were Inkatha hostels, essentially, hostels of migrant workers who were primarily IFP supporters. And they'd made their and those were no-go zones. But the fact that the IFP did ultimately participate at the 11th hour just took away all that violence. Not to say there wasn't conflict in certain areas of KwaZulu-Natal in a minor form, but that was really just, in a sense, electioneering conflict. And not to say it wasn't violent, it was in parts, between the ANC and the IFP. But there was no blanket resistance to the election taking place,
I remember,
which was critical.
Funny, Peter, I don't know how much of a man of nostalgia you are, but on the 27th, on the anniversary of the 94 elections, will it be a poignant day for you? Will you allow yourself to think back on that day, or are you like that?
No, I mean, without question, there will be areas of nostalgia. Thankfully now we run a pretty tight electoral ship.
Yes.
And I think the successive electoral commissions since over the last 20 years have done a really good job. So it's always a pleasure to see a pretty well-run election compared to one which was an extremely difficult one. But I mean, one thinks back and you think back as to how we got through it and barely got through it.